She is nobody.
The candles in the great hall of Bellmore House had never burned so bright, and they had never lit up so much cruelty in one single night. 200 guests stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the gold and crystal chandeliers, holding their breath as an old woman in ivory silk tore a marriage contract in half and let the pieces fall at a young woman's feet. "She is nobody," the Dowager Duchess announced to the room, loud enough for the servants on the staircase to hear. "A scholar's daughter has no place carrying the Bellmore name." What that proud woman did not know, what she could not have known, was that the frail old grandmother watching quietly from the shadows of the staircase had already signed a paper of her own, weeks before, that would turn this night of humiliation into the night everything changed. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, sealed in wax the color of dried blood, and Grace Whitfield had read it 3 times before she believed it was truly meant for her. Duke Nathaniel Bellmore had asked her to attend the midsummer gala as his guest, not as a servant's daughter slipping through the back door, but as a woman standing beside him at the front of the receiving line. She had turned the card over in her hand so many times that the edges had begun to soften, as though touching it enough would prove it was not a mistake. Grace was the daughter of a botanist who had spent his life cataloguing rare plants for gentlemen who never once thanked him by name. She had grown up counting coins instead of collecting jewels, mending her own hems, and learning early that a full stomach mattered more than a fashionable dress. She had never once imagined that a Duke would look at her the way Nathaniel looked at her, like she was the only steady thing in a room full of glitter and noise. Her mother sewed by candlelight for 3 nights running, altering an old blue gown until it fit Grace properly, taking in the waist and letting down the hem, adding a small strip of borrowed lace at the collar because Grace had asked for nothing more elaborate than that. "You do not need diamonds to walk into that house," her mother said, biting off a thread with her teeth. "You need only to walk in like you belong there." Grace was not certain she believed that, but she nodded anyway, because her mother's hands were tired and her mother's hope was fragile, and Grace did not want to be the one who broke it. She arrived at Bellmore House as the evening sun spilled gold across the drive, and the manor rose in front of her like something pulled directly out of a story her father used to tell her as a child, about kingdoms built from stone and stubbornness. Marble columns caught the last of the light. Footmen in white gloves opened doors 2 at a time, moving with the practiced silence of men who had learned never to be noticed. Grace pressed page 3. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans. Her gloved hands together at her waist and reminded herself to breathe slowly, the way she had practiced in the mirror at home. Nathaniel met her at the base of the grand staircase, and for a moment the noise of the gala seemed to fall away entirely, swallowed by the sound of her own heartbeat. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has already decided to build a future with, steady and unhurried, as though the 200 guests filling the hall behind him did not exist at all. "You came," he said simply, and there was relief in his voice that he did not try to hide. "You asked," Grace answered, and something in his eyes softened in a way that made the long walk from her front door feel worth every uncertain step. He offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the fine wool of his coat beneath her fingers. And together they climbed the staircase into a hall glowing with 1,000 candles. Music drifted down from a string quartet tucked into an alcove near the far wall, and the scent of beeswax, perfume, and imported roses hung thick in the warm air. Grace had never stood in a room so beautiful, and for a heartbeat she allowed herself to simply feel it, without fear, without calculation, just the quiet astonishment of a girl who had grown up dreaming of rooms like this one. But as they reached the top step, Grace felt the air shift, the way a garden goes still before a storm breaks over it. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Fans stopped, fluttering. A woman in a gown the color of fresh cream turned slowly to look at her, and Grace felt that gaze land on her skin like cold water. That woman was Duchess Vivienne, Bellmore, Nathaniel's mother, and she studied Grace the way one studies an insect that has wandered somewhere it does not belong, deciding, with a single glance, exactly how much it deserved to be crushed. Nathaniel felt his mother's attention before he even turned to look for it. He leaned close to Grace and spoke low enough that only she could hear him over the music. "Stay near me tonight," he said. "My mother has a temper when she does not get her way, and tonight she very much wants her way." Page 4. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans. Grace nodded, though she did not yet understand exactly what that meant. She would understand very soon, and she would spend the rest of her life grateful that she had not turned and run the moment she felt that first cold gaze settle on her shoulders. Grace let her eyes move briefly across the hall, past the gilded mirrors reflecting candlelight back on itself 100 times over, past the long table already groaning under silver trays of fruit and delicate pastries no one had touched yet, past the young men in tailcoats who watched her the way people watch something unexpected wander into a place built for the expected. She reminded herself that her father had once told her that a room full of wealth was only a room, and that the people standing in it were still only people, however loudly their clothing spoke for them. She held on to that thought the way one holds onto a railing on unfamiliar stairs. Near a table dressed in white linen and tall silver candlesticks, an old woman sat quietly, with both hands folded over the carved head of a wooden cane. She wore deep violet, no jewels beyond a single strand of pearls at her throat, and she watched the staircase with the patient attention of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this particular evening to arrive. This was Dowager Grand Duchess Josephine Bellmore, Nathaniel's grandmother, and though almost no one in that glittering room knew it yet, she was the only person present who understood exactly what was about to happen, because she had spent the better part of a year quietly making certain of it. Josephine had outlived a husband, 2 sisters, and more fashionable opinions of her than she cared to count, and in all that time she had learned the particular value of watching quietly while everyone around her assumed silence meant weakness. She sipped her tea, watched Vivienne cross the hall toward the string quartet to adjust something no one had asked her to adjust, and allowed herself a small, private smile. The evening had only just begun, and already it was unfolding almost exactly as she had hoped it would. Josephine remembered, as she watched Grace climb the staircase beside her grandson, a much younger version of herself standing at the edge of a different ballroom decades earlier, uncertain whether the Bellmore name would ever truly feel like her own. She had married into this family as an outsider too, judged for her modest dowry by relatives. Page 5. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans, long since buried, and she had spent the better part of her life proving, quietly and patiently, that a person's worth was never something other people were entitled to measure. She recognized something of her younger self in the careful, steady way Grace held her shoulders despite the weight of every gaze in the room, and her affection for the girl deepened before a single word had passed between them. She thought, too, of her late husband, the old Duke, who had always insisted that character revealed itself most clearly not in grand gestures but in the small, unwatched moments, the way a person greeted a servant, the way they spoke of those less fortunate than themselves when they believed no one of consequence was listening. Josephine had made a quiet habit, over the months leading up to this gala, of asking her own household staff what they thought of the young woman her grandson so admired, and every answer she received had only strengthened her resolve. The housekeeper spoke of Grace's patience with the kitchen girls, The head groundskeeper spoke of an afternoon Grace had spent helping repot seedlings in the greenhouse without once being asked, simply because she noticed the work needed doing. Small things, all of them, and yet Josephine had learned long ago that small things, gathered carefully enough, told a truer story than any grand performance ever could. Page 6. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Chapter 2, The Contract on the Table. Duchess Vivienne did not waste time on pleasantries. Within the hour, she had summoned the family solicitor, a narrow, sharp-eyed man named Mr. Pratt who carried documents the way other men carried weapons, and she had a table cleared at the center of the hall as though she meant to conduct an execution rather than host a party. Servants exchanged uneasy glances as they moved the flower arrangements aside to make room. "My son will be married before the summer ends," Vivienne announced to the gathered guests, her voice carrying easily over the string quartet, which faltered and then fell silent altogether. To a lady of proper standing. She gestured toward a young woman in emerald silk standing near the fireplace, Lady Beatrice Ashworth, heiress to one of the largest shipping fortunes in the country, and, more importantly to Vivienne, a woman whose family could settle the mounting debts Vivienne had spent years hiding behind expensive dresses and imported wine. Lady Beatrice herself looked distinctly uncomfortable at being gestured toward like a prized mare at auction. She offered Grace a small, apologetic glance across the room. One that seemed to say she had no more chosen this evening's spectacle than Grace had. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He had known his mother was planning something for weeks, catching fragments of hushed conversations behind closed doors, but he had not expected her to plan it here, in front of the entire county, with Grace standing close enough to hear every word land. "Mother," he said quietly, stepping toward the table. "We have discussed this already. I will not sign a contract I did not agree to." "You will sign it," Vivienne replied, not bothering to lower her voice, "because this family cannot survive on your romantic notions alone." "And what exactly does this family need to survive?" Nathaniel asked. "You have never once told me the true state of our finances." Page 7. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Vivienne's composure flickered, just barely, before she smoothed it back into place. "You need not concern yourself with numbers, Nathaniel. That is precisely what I am here to manage." At the edge of the room, Lord Edmund Bellmore, Nathaniel's uncle and the family's supposed financial trustee, sat lower in his chair and stared hard at his own folded hands. He knew exactly why Vivienne needed this marriage to happen, and exactly how much of the family's true financial ruin he had helped her conceal over the years. Guilt sat on him like a heavy coat he no longer knew how to remove, and he could not bring himself to meet his nephew's eyes. Grace watched the scene unfold from a few steps away and felt something cold settle low in her stomach, a feeling she recognized from childhood, the particular dread of standing in a room where the adults were deciding things about her life without asking her opinion of them. She had known Nathaniel's family would not welcome her easily. She had not expected to be paraded and dismissed as a complication in someone else's financial rescue, all before the first course had even been served. Beside her, an elderly woman in lavender leaned toward her companion and whispered, just loudly enough for Grace to catch it. "That is the botanist's girl, is it not?" "Whatever is the Duke thinking, bring her here tonight of all nights." Grace kept her gaze forward and her spine straight, though the words landed somewhere tender all the same. She thought of her father, bent over his notebooks late into the evening, cataloguing flowers that bloomed only once a year and were gone again before most people ever noticed them at all. He had taught her that some of the rarest things in the world went entirely unnoticed by people too busy admiring what glittered instead. She decided, standing There in her altered blue gown, that she would rather be rare and unnoticed than glittering and hollow. Mr. Pratt cleared his throat and shuffled the papers meant for Lady Beatrice's contract. Clearly uncomfortable with the direction the evening had already taken before a single signature had been collected. He was a careful man by nature, and careful men tended to sense trouble long before it announced itself plainly. He glanced once toward Grand. Page 8. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans. Duchess Josephine's table near the window, and something about her stillness unsettled him more than Vivienne's raised voice ever could. Vivienne, unaware of the current running quietly beneath the surface of her carefully staged evening, pressed forward with renewed determination, gesturing for Mr. Pratt to bring the marriage contract closer to the table. There is no need for delay, she said briskly. Lady Beatrice's family has already agreed to the terms. All that remains is a signature. Lady Beatrice, overhearing this from across the room, visibly stiffened. Clearly having agreed to no such certainty in her own mind, whatever arrangements her family might have quietly discussed without consulting her directly. Perhaps, she said carefully, stepping forward for the first time that evening, I might be permitted an opinion on my own engagement, Duchess Vivienne. The room's attention shifted briefly toward her, and a few guests exchanged surprised glances at the heiress's unexpected assertiveness. Vivienne waved the comment away with an impatient flick of her fan, clearly unaccustomed to being questioned by anyone, let alone a young woman she had assumed would be grateful for the match regardless of her own feelings on the matter. This is not a discussion, Beatrice, Vivienne said sharply. This is a solution to a problem that has gone on long enough. Beatrice's cheeks colored, though whether from embarrassment or quiet anger, it was difficult to tell, and she said nothing further. Retreating instead toward the fireplace where she had stood before, arms folded tightly, watching the rest of the evening unfold with the wary detachment of someone who had already decided she wanted no part of whatever came next. Page 9. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans. Chapter 3, called forward. Come here, girl. Vivienne's voice cut through the hall like a blade through silk, and every eye in the room turned toward Grace at once, a weight of attention she felt settled over her like a physical thing. Grace stepped forward because refusing would have made the moment worse, though her heart was pounding so hard she was certain the whole room could hear it beneath the music that had not yet resumed. She kept her chin level and her hand still, remembering her mother's voice from 3 nights before. Walk in like you belong there. Vivienne circled her slowly, the way a buyer circles livestock, taking in the plain blue dress, the absence of jewels, the careful posture of a woman who had been raised to work rather than to be admired for standing still. Tell me, Vivienne said, addressing the room more than she addressed Grace, what dowry does a botanist's daughter bring to a duke's house? What lands? What name? Grace lifted her chin a fraction higher. I bring honesty, she said, and a willingness to work for what I am given, rather than assume I deserve it simply because I was born into it. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd, though whether it was laughter at Grace's expense or at the discomfort of Vivienne's cruelty being spoken so plainly, it was difficult to say. A few guests exchanged glances that looked almost like admiration. Vivienne's face reddened, and her voice climbed a full register. She is nobody, Vivienne declared, loud enough that the musicians in the alcove flinched. A scholar's daughter has no place carrying the Bellmore name, and I will not stand by while my son throws away everything his father built for a passing fascination. She reached for the marriage contract Mr. Pratt held ready, and in a fit of theatrical fury, snatched up instead the folded paper meant to formalize Nathaniel's request to court Grace properly, and tore it cleanly down the middle. The pieces fell at Grace's feet like snow that had lost all its softness, and for a moment the entire hall seemed to hold its breath along with her. Page 10. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans. Grace did not cry. She had promised herself, walking up that staircase, that whatever happened tonight, she would not give this woman the satisfaction of her tears. She looked down at the torn paper, then back up at Vivienne, and said nothing at all, letting the silence speak instead. Somewhere behind her, she heard Lord Edmund shift uncomfortably in his chair, the creak of old wood the only sound in a hall gone otherwise silent. She did not yet know his name, or what secret sat behind his lowered eyes, but she recognized the particular stillness of a man who wanted very badly to intervene and did not have the courage to do it. She filed the thought away, the way her father had taught her to note small details about a plant before deciding whether it was safe to touch. Not everyone in this room was her enemy. Some of them were simply afraid. She thought too of the letters her father used to receive, thanking him quietly for advice given freely, for seeds shared without cost, for hours spent teaching a neighbor's child to read plant labels in Latin simply because the child had asked. None of those letters had ever mentioned money, or land, or family names. They had mentioned only kindness, remembered plainly and gratefully. Grace held that memory now like a small candle, cupped against wind, and found, to her quiet surprise, that it was enough to keep her standing steady in a room built entirely to make her feel small. Across the hall, a cluster of young women near the refreshment table whispered behind painted fans, their eyes darting between Grace and the torn paper still lying on the floor. One of them, a girl no older than Grace herself, looked distinctly uncomfortable with the spectacle, glancing away each time Vivienne's voice rose again. Grace noticed her discomfort and filed it away too, another small proof that cruelty, however loudly it announced itself, rarely spoke for an entire room. Vivienne, sensing that her audience had not responded with the immediate agreement she expected, pressed harder still. Perhaps, she said, circling Grace once more, you believe a pretty face and a clever tongue are enough to secure a duke's affection. I assure you, girl, affection fades quickly once the reality of empty pockets sets in. Grace held her ground, refusing to let the words land visibly on her face, though privately she. Page 11. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans. Wondered how a woman surrounded by so much borrowed grandeur could speak so confidently about the emptiness of other people's pockets. Grace thought of her father again, of the many evenings he had come home with dirt still under his fingernails, tired but never once ashamed of the work that fed their small household, and she found, standing in that glittering hall, that she would not have traded that honest tiredness for all the borrowed jewels in the room. She met Vivienne's eyes steadily and said nothing further, letting her silence carry the same quiet dignity her father had carried through every difficult season of their modest life together. Page 12. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans. Chapter 4. The Duke steps forward. Nathaniel crossed the hall in full long strides and placed himself between his mother and Grace, one hand raised, palm out, not in violence but in absolute refusal. That is enough, he said, and his voice, though quiet, silenced the room more completely than his mother's shouting ever had. Nathaniel. I said enough, mother. He turned to face the assembled guests, 200 pairs of eyes fixed on him, and he did not flinch beneath the weight of them. I will not marry Lady Beatrice. I will not be handed off like a debt to be settled by strangers. And I will not stand here and watch this woman be humiliated for the crime of being honest, in a room full of people who have long forgotten how. He reached back and found Grace's hand without looking, and when their fingers laced together, a soft gasp moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. You would throw away this family's future for her? Vivienne demanded, her voice cracking on the last word in a way that betrayed more fear than fury. I would build a better future with her, Nathaniel answered steadily, than I ever could. With anyone chosen for me by a ledger. Lady Beatrice, near the fireplace, let out an audible breath of relief and did not bother to hide it. She had spent the entire carriage ride to Bellmore House rehearsing polite refusals, certain she would need every one of them by evening's end, and she had never once expected the Duke himself to spare her the trouble. Grace, for her part, stood very still with Nathaniel's hand wrapped around hers, feeling the warmth of it more than she trusted herself to say aloud. She had not asked him to defend her publicly. She had not asked him to risk anything at all on her behalf. And yet, there he stood, a duke in front of 200 witnesses, choosing her without hesitation, and something in her chest loosened that she had not realized was clenched so tightly all evening. Page 13. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Behind them, a cluster of older gentlemen exchanged low murmurs, some clearly scandalized by Nathaniel's public defiance of his own mother, others watching with poorly hidden approval, the kind reserved for a young man finally showing the backbone his title demanded of him. One elderly guest, a friend of the late Duke, raised his glass slightly toward Nathaniel, a small, private gesture of respect that Nathaniel caught and returned with a brief nod, grateful for even one voice of quiet support in a hall otherwise thick with judgment. Grace felt Nathaniel's hand tighten briefly around hers, a small, private reassurance meant only for her, and she found herself thinking, absurdly, of her father's greenhouse back home, of the way certain plants bent instinctively toward whatever light they could find, however small it seemed against the surrounding dark. She had spent so long bracing herself for this family to reject her outright that she had not fully prepared for what it might feel like to be chosen instead, publicly, without hesitation, by the one person in that hall whose opinion mattered most to her. Vivienne opened her mouth to respond, fury written plainly across every line of her face. But before she could speak again, a new voice entered the hall, calm, measured, and carrying the particular authority that comes only from decades of being underestimated by people who should have known better. Sit down, Vivienne, said Grand Duchess Josephine, rising slowly from her chair at last, her cane tapping once against the marble floor for emphasis. You have said quite enough for one evening. Now it is my turn. Page 14. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Chapter 5, The Quiet Grandmother. The hall watched, stunned into silence, as Josephine made her way across the marble floor, her cane tapping a slow and steady rhythm that somehow felt louder than the string quartet had all night. Nathaniel moved instinctively to offer his arm, but she waved him off gently, a small smile touching the corner of her mouth, as if to say she had waited 30 years for this walk and intended to take it on her own 2 feet. Mr. Pratt, the solicitor, stepped forward at her signal and produced a second folder from beneath his coat, one bound in worn leather and sealed with red wax far older than anything Vivienne had brought to the table that night. For 30 years, Josephine began, her voice carrying easily despite its softness, I have watched this family value name over character and title over truth. I have watched my daughter-in-law spend money that was never truly hers to spend, and I have watched my grandson search for something honest in a house full of performance. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room slowly, meeting eyes here and there as though daring anyone to interrupt her. Tonight, that search is over. Vivienne's confidence, so absolute only moments before, began to crack visibly across her face like glaze on old porcelain. Josephine, what is the meaning of this? The meaning, Josephine said, is that you are not the only person in this family capable of arranging a contract, Vivienne. You simply assumed you were the only one clever enough to use one properly. A murmur of nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, quickly hushed. Grace stood Very still, Nathaniel's hand still wrapped around hers, and felt the entire direction of the evening tilt beneath her feet like the deck of a ship catching a new and unexpected wind. She had no idea what was in that leather folder, but she could see, in the sudden pallor of Vivienne's face, that it was something the Duchess had never wanted brought into the light. Nathaniel looked at his grandmother with an expression Grace had not seen on him all evening, equal parts surprise and something close to awe, as though he too were only. Page 15. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Now understanding how much this quiet old woman had been watching, and waiting, and planning, long before anyone else in the family thought to take her seriously. Josephine caught his eye and gave him the smallest, most private of smiles, the kind shared only between two people who trust each other completely. Vivienne, for her part, looked between her son and her mother-in-law with dawning horror, the particular horror of a woman realizing too late that she had spent so long watching for threats from the front of the room that she had entirely forgotten to watch. The quiet corner by the window. She opened her mouth once more, some protest half formed on her lips, but Mr. Pratt was already unfolding the document, and the moment for objection had quietly, irreversibly, passed her by. Grace watched Vivienne's composure unravel and felt, unexpectedly, a flicker of something close to sympathy beneath her own lingering hurt. She recognized, even now, that Vivienne's cruelty had grown from fear rather than simple malice, the fear of a woman who had built her entire identity around control and was now watching that control dissolve in front of 200 witnesses. It did not excuse the humiliation of an hour before, but it helped Grace understand it, and understanding, she found, made it easier to imagine a future where forgiveness might one day be possible. Page 16. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Chapter 6, Shadows of the Estate. What the guests did not know, what Vivienne had spent years making certain no one would ever know, was the true state of the Bellmore fortune. Behind the gowns and the gaslit chandeliers, behind the imported wine and the endless parade of gala nights, the estate's reserves had been quietly bleeding out for the better part of a decade. Vivienne had gambled on investments that failed one after another, covered the losses with loans she never fully repaid, and leaned on Lord Edmund, the family's appointed trustee, to keep the true numbers hidden from Nathaniel until she could marry him into a fortune large enough to erase the debt entirely and quietly. Edmund had gone along with it at first out of loyalty to his late brother's memory, and later out of simple fear, watching the numbers grow worse each year until he no longer knew how to stop the lie without destroying the family he had sworn to protect when Nathaniel's father died. He sat now in his chair near the fireplace, shoulders bowed low, unable to meet his sister-in-law's eyes as the truth crept steadily closer to the surface of the room. He remembered, with a fresh stab of shame, the letters he had helped Vivienne draft to creditors, the accounts he had quietly reshuffled, the small lies that had grown, month after month, into something far larger than he had ever intended them to become. He had told himself each time that it was only temporary, only until things improved. Things had never improved. Josephine had known for over a year. She had spent that year quietly building the one document that could undo everything Vivienne had constructed, not out of spite, and not out of a desire to punish her daughter-in-law publicly, but out of a grandmother's simple wish to see her grandson happy with a woman who loved him honestly, rather than shackled to a stranger for the sake of a balance sheet no one had ever shown him. It had begun, quietly enough, with an old trunk in the attic that no one had opened in decades, full of her late husband's correspondence, and a single letter from a modest botanist thanking the Duke for his discretion regarding a loan neither man ever spoke of. Again, Josephine had recognized the surname at once, and had spent the following. Page 17. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Months making careful, unhurried inquiries, visiting the family solicitor under the pretense of updating her own affairs, learning everything she could about the quiet, hard-working family that had once saved her husband's legacy without ever asking for recognition. She had watched Nathaniel grow fond of Grace from a distance for months before that evening, and she had said nothing, waiting patiently for the right moment to let the truth do the work she never needed to do herself. More than once, Josephine had considered simply telling Nathaniel everything long before the gala, sparing him the theatre of it entirely. But she had decided, after much thought over quiet cups of tea by her window, that some truths landed deeper when they arrived at the moment a family needed them most, rather than delivered early and forgotten in the ordinary business of everyday life. Vivienne's cruelty, as much as Josephine regretted watching it unfold, had given the truth exactly the stage it needed to matter. She had also, quietly, made certain that Nathaniel would never doubt Grace's place in the family once the truth came out, by ensuring the revelation arrived not as a private correction whispered over tea, but as an undeniable public fact witnessed by the very people who had questioned Grace's worth most loudly. Josephine understood, better than most, that some lessons needed an audience in order to truly take root, and she had spent 30 patient years waiting for precisely the right one to gather in her grandson's hall. She had also spent those quiet months preparing Mr. Pratt thoroughly, walking him through every clause of the original trust, anticipating every objection Vivienne might raise, and ensuring that when the moment finally came, there would be no gap in the legal foundation for anyone to exploit. Josephine had learned, over decades of managing a household through good years and lean ones alike, that good intentions alone rarely survived contact with a determined opponent, and she was determined that her grandson's happiness would rest on something far sturdier than good intentions. It would rest on paper, properly signed, properly witnessed, and utterly beyond dispute. There were nights, in those quiet months of preparation, when Josephine doubted her own plan, wondering whether exposing Vivienne so publicly was truly the kindest path. Page 18. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans forward, or simply the most satisfying one. She had sat with that doubt honestly, turning it over the way she turned over difficult decisions her whole life, and had ultimately decided that kindness toward Grace and honesty toward the entire family mattered more, in the end, than sparing Vivienne a discomfort she had inflicted on so many others without a second thought. Page 19. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Chapter 7, The Unsealing of the Trust. Mr. Pratt broke the wax seal and unfolded the document with the careful reverence of a man handling something far older and far more important than paper. This, he announced to the hall, his voice steady, is the founding land trust of the Bellmore Eastfield holdings, drawn up 31 years ago and witnessed by the late Duke himself. He began to read, and the room grew so quiet that the only sound was the soft hiss of the candles burning down in their silver holders, and somewhere far off, the faint clink of a dropped fork in the kitchens below. The trust described a debt of honor, a substantial sum lent to the Bellmore family during a financial crisis 3 decades earlier, at a time when the estate had come dangerously close to collapse entirely, its lands nearly sold off piece by piece to cover unpaid obligations. The lender had asked for no interest, no repayment schedule, and no public acknowledgement of any kind. He had asked only for one condition, sealed quietly into the trust and forgotten by nearly everyone in that hall except the frail old woman now standing at its center. The condition, Mr. Pratt continued, adjusting his spectacles, states that should a descendant of the lender ever be connected to the Bellmore family by marriage, the Eastfield lands and their income shall transfer, in full, to that descendant, as recognition of a debt this family could never truly repay in coin. Vivienne's face had gone the color of the candle wax pooling on the table beside her. Whose debt? She whispered, her voice barely audible now. Whose descendant? Mr. Pratt's voice carried each word with the careful precision of a man who understood. That legal language, however dry it might sound, could carry more weight in a single sentence than an hour of shouting ever could. He read the description of the original. Crisis, a season of failed harvests across the Bellmore tenant farms combined with a disastrous investment in foreign shipping that had very nearly bankrupted the estate, entirely forcing the late Duke to consider selling off ancestral land that had belonged to the family for 6 generations. He read of a quiet visit from a modest man with page 20. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Ink-stained fingers and a leather satchel, who had offered a sum large enough to save everything, and who had refused every attempt at repayment beyond the simple written promise now unfolding in front of the stunned crowd. He read further, describing how the late Duke had wept openly in his study the night the loan was secured, certain his family's centuries-old legacy would survive another generation only because of a stranger's quiet generosity, and how he had turned to his young wife, Josephine, that same evening and made her swear that whatever else happened in their lives, that particular debt would never be allowed to fade quietly into forgotten history. Josephine had kept that promise for 31 years, through her husband's death, through Nathaniel's childhood, through every gala and dinner and quiet family disagreement in between, waiting patiently for the moment the debt could finally, properly, be repaid. Mr. Pratt paused briefly in his reading, allowing the weight of that particular detail to settle over the hall, before continuing with the final clauses of the trust, each one written in the careful, deliberate hand of a solicitor who had understood, even 3 decades earlier, that this document might one day need to stand as unquestionable proof before a room full of skeptical witnesses. He noted, for the benefit of anyone still doubting its authenticity, that the trust had been registered with the county records office in the same season it was signed, and remained, to this day, a matter of public record for anyone who cared to verify it themselves. The guests nearest the table leaned in without quite meaning to, drawn by the particular hush that settles over a room when everyone senses history quietly rearranging itself in front of them. Somewhere near the staircase, a young footman who had been serving wine all evening stood frozen mid-step, tray balanced forgotten in his hands, as caught up in the moment as any titled guest in the hall. Josephine turned, slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at Grace, her expression softening into something almost tender. Page 21. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Chapter 8, The Truth Revealed. Grace's grandfather, Josephine said, her voice steady and clear enough to reach the farthest corner of the hall, was the man who saved this family from ruin 31 years ago. He asked for nothing in return but his privacy, and I gave him my word, on the day he signed this trust, that his kindness would never be forgotten, even if the world never learned his name. Grace felt the room spin gently around her, the candlelight blurring at the edges of her vision. She had grown up hearing stories about her grandfather's quiet generosity, his habit of helping people who never thought to thank him properly, his old worn ledger full of names he had helped and never once mentioned again. She had never once imagined that the family she had been publicly humiliated by only an hour earlier owed the very ground beneath their marble floors to her own bloodline. She is not nobody, Josephine continued, turning back to face Vivienne, her voice hardening just slightly. She is the granddaughter of the man who kept this family from losing everything it had. And as of tonight, by the terms of a trust you never bothered to read carefully enough, the Eastfield lands and their income belong to her. A murmur rolled through the crowd, disbelief tangled with something close to admiration, and a few guests near the staircase actually began to applaud quietly before catching themselves. Lady Beatrice, who had never particularly wanted this marriage to begin with, quietly excused herself from the center of the room, visibly relieved to be Released from a contract she had never asked for and had dreaded signing for weeks. Vivienne stood frozen, the marriage contract still crumpled uselessly in her hand. Staring at the woman she had called unworthy only an hour before, the same woman. Who now, by law and by blood, held more claim to the Bellmore estate's true wealth than she did. This cannot be legal, Vivienne finally managed. It has been legal for 31 years, Josephine replied calmly. You simply never thought to ask what you did not already control. Page 22. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Grace turned to look at Nathaniel, half expecting to see calculation in his eyes, some quiet recalculation of what she was now worth to him. She found none. He was watching her the same way he had watched her at the bottom of the staircase hours before, as though the trust, the lands, and the income attached to her name were the least interesting thing in the room compared to the woman standing in front of him. It was, Grace realized, the first time in her life that her worth had been decided by someone and had not changed a single thing about how they treated her. Mr. Pratt gathered the remaining papers into his leather folder with a satisfaction he did not bother to hide, having spent months quietly assisting Josephine's careful preparations without once breathing a word of it to Vivienne, who had trusted him only because she had never thought to ask whether his loyalty belonged to her or to the family's true founding matriarch. He caught Josephine's eye across the hall and allowed himself the smallest of nods, a solicitor's quiet acknowledgement of a case well and honestly won. Somewhere near the back of the hall, the same young footman who had frozen mid-step during the reading finally remembered his tray and continued his rounds, though he moved now with a bounce in his step that had nothing to do with his duties and everything to do with having just witnessed, firsthand, a story he knew he would be retelling to his own family for years to come. Even the household staff, who so rarely mattered in the grand dramas of their employers, understood instinctively that they had watched something rare unfold that evening, a wrong quietly and thoroughly set right. Page 23. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Chapter 9, A Reversal of Fortune. For the first time in longer than anyone in that hall could remember, Vivienne Bellmore had nothing to say. Her leverage, her certainty, her carefully constructed authority over her son's future had all collapsed in the space of a single reading. Lord Edmund finally lifted his head, his eyes wet with something between shame and relief, and quietly confirmed what Josephine had said, admitting before the gathered guests that the debts were real, the concealment was real, and the trust was legally binding beyond any dispute Vivienne might try to raise. I am sorry, Vivienne, he said quietly. I should have told Nathaniel the truth years ago. I let my fear speak louder than my conscience, and I am ashamed of it. Vivienne did not answer him. She stood very still, her elaborate gown suddenly looking less like armor and more like a costume she no longer had the strength to wear. Grace could have used that moment for revenge. She had every right to, after the humiliation of the evening, after watching a contract meant for her own future torn apart at her feet in front of 200 strangers. Instead, she crossed the room to where Vivienne stood, shoulders trembling now instead of proud, and spoke gently enough that only those nearby could hear her. I am not interested in taking your home from you, Grace said. I only ask that you stop deciding, for everyone around you, who is worthy and who is not. Let people prove that for themselves, the way I have had to, every single day of my life. Vivienne said nothing in return, but something in her rigid posture finally broke her shoulders curving inward, and for the first time that evening, she looked less like a duchess defending her legacy and more like a tired woman who had spent so long protecting a lie that she had forgotten entirely how to live without one. Nathaniel watched Grace with an expression that had nothing to do with the trust, or the estate, or the scandal that would surely be the talk of the county for months to come. He watched her the way a man watches someone he has just realized he underestimated. In the best possible way. Page 24. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Slowly, the string quartet found its courage again, and a hesitant, uneven melody began to fill the hall once more, guests exchanging whispered theories about everything they had just witnessed, certain this particular midsummer gala would be recounted at dinner tables for years. Josephine settled back into her chair by the window with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had spent 30 years playing a very long game, and had finally, patiently, won it without raising her voice once. Slowly, the guests who had spent the evening watching the drama unfold began to shift back into the easy rhythms of a gala, though the conversation now had an entirely different flavor than it had carried an hour before. Where earlier the whispers had circled around Grace's unsuitability, they now circled around the sheer audacity of the evening's reversal, and more than one guest found themselves glancing toward Grace with newfound curiosity rather than judgment. She noticed the shift and did not let it move her either way. She had learned, in the space of one long evening, exactly how quickly a room's opinion could turn, in either direction, and she resolved quietly never to build her sense of worth on something so easily swayed by gossip and candlelight. Lady Beatrice approached Grace before the evening ended, offering a brief, genuine curtsy that surprised them both. "I hope you will not think ill of me for the position your evening was put in," she said. "I never wanted this marriage any more than your Duke did." Grace assured her there were no hard feelings between them, and the two women parted as something closer to allies than rivals, a small kindness neither of them had expected to find amid the wreckage of Vivienne's carefully staged evening. Later that night, after most of the guests had departed and the candles had burned down to soft, guttering stubs, Lord Edmund approached Nathaniel privately near the empty hearth. "I owe you a fuller accounting than I gave tonight," he said quietly. "Every ledger, every hidden debt, laid out plainly, whenever you are ready to see it." Nathaniel studied his uncle for a long moment, weighing years of quiet resentment against the visible shame now written across the older man's face, and finally nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight, I think this family has had enough reckoning for one evening." Grace, overhearing this exchange from a few steps away, felt a quiet admiration settle over her for Nathaniel's restraint, the way he had chosen patience over triumph even in. Page 25. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. A moment that would have justified far harsher words toward the uncle who had helped hide so much from him for so long. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of steadiness she hoped to build a marriage around, a willingness to hold people accountable without losing sight of their humanity in the process. She found herself, not for the first time that evening, deeply grateful for the particular kind of man Nathaniel had chosen to be, long before she had ever entered his life to test the truth of it. Page 26. The Duke's mother called her unworthy, his grandmother had other plans. Chapter 10, A New Legacy. By the time autumn arrived, Bellmore House had changed in ways no one attending the midsummer gala could have predicted. Nathaniel and Grace married quietly, without the spectacle Vivienne had once insisted upon, surrounded only by the people who genuinely wished them well, in a small stone chapel at the edge of the Eastfield lands that now bore Grace's name on its old parish register. Grace's mother sat in the front pew in a new dress she had sewn herself, and cried through the entire ceremony without a single trace of shame. Josephine stood near the front of the gathering, leaning on her cane, smiling the deeply satisfied smile of a woman who had waited 30 years to see a debt of kindness finally repaid in full, and who had spent that same year quietly outmaneuvering every objection her daughter-in-law could raise, one patient step at a time. Vivienne, humbled but not banished, remained at Bellmore House under entirely new terms, no longer in command of the estate's finances, but slowly, carefully, learning what it meant to earn respect rather than simply demand it. She began, in small and awkward ways, to speak to Grace without condescension, and once, quietly, without an audience to witness it, she thanked her for not taking everything away when she'd had every right to. Lord Edmund devoted himself fully to untangling the mess of debts he had helped hide for so long, determined to leave the estate more honest than he had found it, working long hours by lamplight over ledgers he had once falsified, correcting each entry by hand. Grace never forgot where she came from, and she never let the Eastfield fortune change the plain, steady way she treated the people around her. She opened the estate's gardens to local families who could never have afforded such beauty otherwise, honoring her father's quiet belief that knowledge and kindness should never be locked behind a gate, meant only for the wealthy. Children who had once only glimpsed Bellmore House from the road now ran freely between its rose beds on Sunday afternoons, and Grace watched. Page 27. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans. Them from the veranda with a happiness that felt nothing like the loneliness she had known as a girl. Her father, though he never grew entirely comfortable with the grandeur of his daughter's new life, took quiet pride in walking the Eastfield grounds each season, cataloguing the wildflowers that grew there with the same careful devotion he had given every garden before it. Nathaniel often joined him on these walks, learning the names of plants he had walked past his entire life without ever once noticing, and finding, in that simple shared curiosity, a closeness with his father-in-law he had never expected to discover. The county, in time, stopped speaking of the Midsummer Gala as a scandal and began speaking of it instead as the night the Bellmore family remembered what it had nearly forgotten, that true legacy was built through generosity quietly given and honestly repaid, rather than through titles worn for show. Young women who had once watched Grace be humiliated on that staircase now wrote to her for advice on matters far beyond fashion, curious how a botanist's daughter had managed to hold her ground so steadily in a room built to make her feel otherwise. Grace answered each letter herself, in her own plain handwriting, never once forgetting the girl she had been before that night, standing at the bottom of a grand staircase with nothing but her mother's careful stitching and her father's quiet honesty to carry her through. Josephine lived long enough to see the first of Grace and Nathaniel's children take their first unsteady steps across the same marble floor where the marriage contract had once been torn apart, and she often said, in her later years, that watching that small child stumble happily through a hall that had once nearly torn a family in two was the finest proof she had ever seen that patience, given enough time, always outlasted cruelty. She passed peacefully one winter evening, seated in her favorite chair by the window, the garden she loved dusted lightly with early snow, and the entire county mourned a woman far more of them had underestimated than they ever cared to admit. At her request, her final resting place looked out over the Eastfield gardens rather than the family crypt, so that even in death she might keep watch over the quiet legacy she had spent her life protecting. Grace visited that spot often in the years that followed. Page 28. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans, bringing fresh flowers from her father's cuttings, and she made certain that every child born into the Bellmore family afterward grew up knowing the full story of the grandmother who had waited 30 patient years to prove that kindness, however quietly given, is never truly forgotten. Nathaniel, in his later years, took up the habit himself, walking the Eastfield grounds each spring with his own children beside him, pointing out the wildflowers his father-in-law had once taught him to name, and telling them, every single time, the story of the night their great-grandmother stood quietly by a window and changed the course of an entire family's future without once raising her voice. It became, over the years, the story the Bellmore family told most often at gatherings, more than any tale of titles won or battles fought, because it was the one that reminded them, generation after generation of exactly what kind of family they had chosen to become. And on quiet evenings, when the candles burned low and the halls of Bellmore House finally grew still, Grace would sometimes find Josephine sitting by the window, watching the gardens with the same patient attention she had once used to watch a doorway, waiting for the right moment to change everything for the people she loved. Nathaniel often found her there in those quiet hours, and he would sit beside her, without a word, simply glad, in a way he had not known how to name before that summer, that his family's future now rested in hands as steady and honest as Grace's. He thought sometimes of the boy he had been before that gala, so certain his mother's ambitions were the only path forward for a house like his, and he was grateful, every single day, that a quiet old woman in violet silk had believed enough in patience and in truth to prove him wrong. The lesson of that summer never left the family that lived it. True worth is never measured in name or fortune, but in the quiet, patient character a person carries when no one is applauding them for it. Grace had walked into Bellmore House a stranger with nothing but her mother's altered gown and her father's quiet honesty, and she had walked out of that summer as the woman who taught an entire household what it truly meant to belong. Page 29. The Duke's mother called her unworthy. His grandmother had other plans. Subscribe to see how it all comes together in the full telling, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.